Hi, this is Phil Greenwood of the Weinert Center for Entrepreneurship, the Wiz School for Business. And for part of our entrepreneurial management series, we're interviewing entrepreneurs from around the country, alums and people who have been associated with UW and so on. Today, I guess I'd like to say I'd like to introduce Ilana Nankin, who is the founder, CEO of a company called Breathe for Change. And Ilana is a UW alum, and she'll be able to explain that. So, Ilana, thank you for being with us today. And let me just ask you this up front. Tell us a little bit about your background, especially leading how you came to Madison, and then, ultimately the idea for the venture.
I love it. Thank you for having me. So, I actually am not a Wisconsin. I was not born in Wisconsin or raised in
Not
Wisconsin.
everybody is.
I honestly didn't really know exactly where it was on a map until I got into University of Wisconsin. I'm from the Bay Area, so I grew up in Cupertino, which is south of San Francisco, and then ended up going to UC Berkeley as an undergrad where I studied psychology and education. And I ended up and I knew that from a very young age, I really wanted to be a teacher. My mom was an elementary school teacher my whole life. I would go teach classes when I was like in fifth grade to her third graders, and I thought it was just the best. But I was taking a specific course called Education 190 as an undergraduate at Berkeley, and it was about current issues in education. And the reason I took it was because I was running for student body president of Cal, and my campaign staff said, take the easiest course, and that's Ed 190. And it ended up being the most life-changing course that I had ever taken. So thank heavens I got that opportunity. And it's in that course we learned, there was like 40 of us from diverse backgrounds, and that's really where I learned about the injustices and the inequities and racism, classism, all of the isms that exist within our education system. And it really moved me to do something about it. And so I ended up, for the next 2 years of undergraduate education, co-teaching with my professor this same course that I had taken as an undergrad. And so I had the opportunity to dig even deeper into the content of the course and became very interested in how can I continue to co-facilitate or facilitate spaces like we're doing in this class with young children. Like, how can we engage in courageous conversations about societal issues starting with the little ones? And so I ended up applying to Teach for America, and I got placed in San Francisco. So I went from South Bay to the East Bay at Berkeley to San Francisco.
Able to stay local.
Yeah. And I ended up teaching pre-K at a Spanish dual immersion school. I was the first teacher in SFUSD to teach a full day of pre-K within a K through 5 elementary school. So it was really a part of that movement in integrating early childhood education into the school system. And so I felt really honored to have that opportunity. And I just saw, as I was teaching, just the disparities that existed from day one. I mean, certain kids would walk into my classroom 3 or 4 years old and already knew their letters. They knew how to count. Some of them knew how to read, whereas others didn't even know how to hold a pencil or had no access to any supports from a language perspective, from a developmental perspective. And it all depended on, what was going on in the home. So I saw that the disparities that I was seeing in the college, at that level, happening from basically day one of our kids' education. And as I was teaching, I was so stressed, overwhelmed, overworked. I didn't really have the tools to care for myself. And that's when I first found.
But you hear a lot of educators have that issue all over the country. It's just not enough time in the day to deal with everything.
100%. And that's really what I ended up seeing through my dissertation research at UW. So like essentially as a first year teacher, I became introduced to like yoga and mindfulness, and it truly inspired, well, it impacted my well-being. I ended up integrating some of these practices into my classroom with my kids and saw extraordinary transformations in them, social, emotionally, and academically. And that's what brought me to Madison. I was like, I need to explore this more. So
So
I
that's
ended
when
up,
you PhD program. Now, was it in curriculum and instruction
yeah,
or, okay, which
yeah,
is like one of the top, if not the top rated
number one for
in the
20
country,
years.
right? A lot of people don't know that. We got a pretty strong education program. So anyways,
Yeah.
so you decided on your PhD. What as you got further along in when did you start formulating your research idea and your
Yeah.
dissertation topic and so on?
So super interesting. So I am obsessed with teaching. So why I wanted to pursue the PhD is so that I could be a teacher educator. And most people go in for research. I was like, I want to teach the teachers. So I ended up uh, teaching a ton of courses, a lot about like equity and social justice and early childhood education. And after 2 years, when my cohort graduated, so my undergraduates who were juniors and seniors, graduated, and this was about the time I was in your course.
Yeah, all honesty, Ilana attended MHR 722, which is entrepreneurial management. So that's where we got to know each other. So go ahead.
I attribute all of my progress and success to Phil Greenwood,
No, please don't say
a
that.
dear advisor. So when my first group of students graduated, I started to ask myself, if and how are these amazing teachers that we've, learned together and grown together over 2 years, how are they going to take up their ideals of social justice in action in their actual classrooms? Like we talk about these things for 2 years, but how does it translate? And so I ended up creating a community of practice for a group of 8 of my students and myself to stay connected over their first year of teaching. And, I collected monthly reflections from before their year started to during the year to after the year. I had interviews with each of them. We got on community calls each month to see how they were doing. And what ended up revealing itself was these teachers, just like me, were so stressed. And they were like social justice activist type. They were stressed, they were overwhelmed, they were overworked, and they just didn't have the tools to take care of themselves, let alone meet the social emotional needs of their kids. And that negative cycle of well-being was impacting their teaching.
So this was the group you taught while you were at UW. They went off into the I don't want to say the real world, but out in the educational world. And that's, you stayed in touch and that was the foundation of your research for your dissertation.
Exactly. And so I had no idea that this was going to lend itself to me building a business. I literally was just, what I knew that I needed because of who I am for my research in order to like finish that PhD was to feel deeply connected on a like human level to my research. And that meant like staying connected to my students and continuing to support them. So this was like me concocting an idea that would allow me to stay super inspired till the finish line. But interestingly enough, at the time that I was seeing how universal the issue of teacher stress and burnout was through my research, and this was within a month, 2 months of their first year of teaching, I had just gotten my yoga teacher certification, and it was absolutely life-changing for me. I mean, unbelievable. And I was still teaching courses at UW to my amazing juniors and seniors, and they found out I was a yoga teacher. I had not taught any yoga. I just like took the training for my own well-being. And they ended up behind my back renting out space in the student union, which is exactly where you're seated right now.
At least in my mind, that's where I'm seated. Yeah.
Exactly. My imaginary student union that I wish we were really sitting in right now. So they rented out space in the union for me to teach them yoga each week in addition to my 3-hour course. And what ended up happening is every single day, my students would come up to me and say things like, oh my gosh, Ilana, the kids who normally have anxiety attacks before tests are utilizing these breathing techniques that you taught us. and their test scores are increasing. Or like students who experience so much trauma in the home are learning how to breathe, and everything is improving. And one thing led to the next. I was like, all right, my dissertation is revealing how universal the issue of teacher stress and burnout is. And I knew that from my own experience, but like this was just evidence. You cannot ignore that through my research.
So
And
at,
then
so at this point in time, I mean, you hadn't been thinking of a venture, of a business, but you were in the midst of the dissertation, collecting data
yep.
and so
So
on.
it was the start of my third year in my PhD. Typically people take about 5-6 years
Oh,
to
I took like
finish it.
7. So
Yeah. But I'll talk a little more about how mine got fast tracked, and it was because of my venture. But so I was just about to take my prelims in December. So I was collecting it before my prelims, which is not necessarily normal. But
no.
I was just wanted this to be my project. And so on December 10th, that's my birthday, and that was the prelims, and I passed it, which was a huge accomplishment. And then December 11th, I was in the class. It was my last class with my students, the juniors who I was teaching yoga to. And I said, how do you want to spend the last 3 hours? And they're like, let's take this shit international. We want to be trained by you. We got to like build a movement here.
Oh,
So
wow.
actually, and most people don't really know this because it takes a while to explain every detail of the story, but really Breathe for Change was deeply inspired by my students at UW who
Which is, I mean, and you know, we always talk about, and I'm sure you've heard it out in the Bay Area, the lean startup and you know, getting customer feedback. And you're an example of that. Before, one, it got popular, and two, before we even knew what to call it. But you got all this feedback and information, and the opportunity kind of pulled you into it.
Mm-hmm. And at the same time, I was still talking. And then that next week was when I interviewed my 8 students for my dissertation. And we had started talking about wellness and mindfulness and yoga, and they started integrating it. And so I was talking to them about this idea, and they were all like, we have to do it. So it became this like collective effort because they were all in it together. They saw how stressed each other were, and they were like, Ilana, let's go for it. So in January 2015, I was like, nothing's going to stop me. I am starting a movement that is on a mission to enhance the health and well-being, first and foremost, of our amazing educators, but also students and entire school communities. And I set out to start the world's only 200-hour wellness and yoga teacher training that was specifically for educators. And you remember that whole thing,
Oh,
Phil.
I remember meeting with you guys. And now when you went through that, you were kind of contemplating for-profit, not-for-profit, and you decided to take at that time, the for-profit route, if I remember right.
So actually, first we ended up partnering with the Lawn Entrepreneurship Clinic,
Mm-hmm.
which was so supportive. And
Smith and everybody, yeah.
And I, as someone who is like very much I identify as like a social impact person. I didn't even think about building a for-profit. I was like, oh, this is a nonprofit. It's an education organization. So I filed for 501c3, and then the paperwork takes forever. So we waited and waited. And then that summer was our first training. And it was just life-changing for these educators. We brought 34 teachers from around the country to Madison, Wisconsin, to do this 200-hour thing that had never existed before. And the ripple effects of that were extraordinary. But that's when Michael Fenchel, who became a co-founder, who is a dear friend of mine, and I would call him when, those first 6 months, be like, I don't know what I'm doing starting a company. I don't have any business background. He was like an entrepreneur through and through, and he would give me some advice.
Computer science, and he had worked with other startups, and
yeah.
So then you two worked together. What was it that said you kind of came to the conclusion, I think we could make a business out of this instead of just leaving it in a 50, I always forget, 501c3, a nonprofit.
So basically, Michael came to the training And he was so inspired by what he saw. He was planning to move to Bali to like take some time off from entrepreneurship and just do his thing. But he was so moved to tears that he came up to me the day of the graduations, where we brought 350 people to the Majestic.
Oh, yeah, I remember it.
And he said, give me a 2-month trial period. I'm going to help you turn this into a real business. And I was like, great. Handshake, let's do this. And so he ended up, it was like as lean startup as you could possibly get. We worked 24 hours together. We put poster boards, poster papers all over the house, writing our vision and mission. And then we also got into one of the accelerators.
100 State? Was that the?
Well, he was a co-founder of 100 State.
Okay.
But what was it called?
I'll have to look it up. I think I remember, but it was up off the Capitol Square, right?
Well,
or was the first one Mad Works, and then eventually you moved over to it?
That's what it was.
Mad Works, and then you went over to 100 State.
Yeah. So MadWorks was just supporting us and figuring this out. And then we ended up deciding that, we'll keep the nonprofit because that could be amazing down the line for us in order to make our trainings more accessible and inclusive. But ultimately we saw a scalable business model and really wanted to have control of the direction of the company. And so we started an LLC, and, let's see, in September, I was taking a yoga class in San Francisco, visiting home, and somehow ended up connecting with someone who was on the same row as me because I heard her say the word middle school. And I asked her, hey, did you just say yoga in middle schools? And she goes, are you Ilana Nankin? And she's like, I've been stalking what you're doing. And she became our first employee.
Oh, wow.
And then a month later, we were at the nonprofit day in Madison, and someone was doing a headstand, met Michael, was just Angie. She was like blown away that we had started Breathe for Change, and she loved marketing, and she was like, how can I help? And she became our next employee. And then our next employee was one of my best friends since 2008. And we were on a hike, and he was, had done the whole, education route, then ed tech, and was just like, his soul was gone. And he's like, I want that energy that you have. I want to help this mission. And so by the end of the year, we had 5 of us, and
that shows the importance of having a really strong social mission. People can really buy into it, and it is a motivator for when you're hiring people and working with people, as well as customers and stuff. Now, before we move on, when you decided to become a for-profit, did that change the perception in the marketplace at all, or has that ever? Because I know in some venues, like in government and education, they may say, well, we can only work with nonprofits, or we can't work with. Did that ever become an issue, or was that ever?
Honestly, from perception wise, there's like judgments around for profit, and that I haven't felt it. The only place where it shows up would be like if we, we don't get a discount because we're not a nonprofit, or there's some sort of like, sure, people only partner with nonprofits, but we do have a nonprofit. So that's the beauty, is like right now we're really trying to focus on how do we have the two, create that hybrid model and have the two speak to each other, so that the nonprofit can really make our programs more accessible.
Which I think that's the ideal, because the for-profit can attract certain stakeholders and investors, and same thing with the nonprofit, and they both can have similar but different missions and such.
Mm-hmm.
So after you got through the first year and you got your first training, your groups into Madison, like after your first or second year, how many people were you trained, or have you trained up to this point before the COVID-19 situation? What's been kind of like your growth rate and things that you've really liked and challenges you faced?
I mean, it's pretty honestly amazing to reflect back. It's just like I've been so focused on growth for so long that sometimes you don't take a pause to be like, wow. Um, so that first year, we certified 34 educators through our training. And they all go back and they become leaders of wellness and social emotional learning in their entire communities. So like, it's not just, they're not just impacting just their students, they're also impacting, like they're bringing wellness workshops to their staff, or yoga classes to all the kids at the school, or family workshops to enhance well-being. I mean, it's all across the map of what the ripple effects are. So the next year we expanded to the Bay Area because I was like, we're going to take it home, and New York City. And I had a amazing fellowship at Sesame Street after my first year in my PhD.
Yep.
And so had great relationships with the leaders in Sesame. And so Sesame Street hosted our first training in New York City.
Wow.
And when Elmo and Big Bird came, I was like, we're on to something.
You've arrived.
Yeah. So we certified 185 teachers across 3 cities the second year. We expanded our model that year too. So we had only done summer trainings because it's when teachers have off. But then we decided to do weekend trainings throughout the school year. So it became a year-long business. And then that third year, we certified 600 teachers across 6 cities. And then the next year, 1,100 across 11 cities. And since over the last 5 years before COVID, we had certified about just a little over 4,000 educators across the country through we're not talking like a 2-hour training, we're talking a 200-hour. And to give you insight into what that looks like, it's an 11-hour day for 18 days in a row, like that level of leadership.
That's like an intense month straight through. So
yeah.
So along, and I remember when you first got started, one of the things you were thinking about is, well, once we get, and you still got thousands of other educators to train, so you still have a market to address. But what have you done once you've trained your educators? How do you develop stickiness where they come back and do new services, or what do you do to maybe have repeat customers?
So I'm glad that you asked that, because we had so much success with like this, with growing the 200-hour, that we had actually, I would say, honed in on getting that so sustainable. Because when we grew really fast, we ended up raising money and capital to like help with that growth. And then we ended up bringing on my amazing partner, Yen, who is now our chief business officer. He's been my best friend since I have 14, and he's like my life partner. I love him. He was the first person I called when I was like, I'm starting Breathe for Change. And then 2 days later, he flew to Madison in 2015, helped me write the business plan, and we ended up winning the Burrell competition, that education award. So he's now our chief business officer. And when we brought him on a year and a half ago, it was really to be like, okay, we've grown this, but it's not necessarily a sustainable, scalable model because our expenses are so high. And so since then, we've really been focused on becoming that lean startup, and then making sure that that larger training is sustainable, scalable, profitable, so that then we can add more
product, more services.
And then COVID happened, and that forced us to do that.
Why don't you tell us about COVID? Because you're again one of these ventures where I don't want to say a business benefited from it, but it really did affect your, both short-term and long-term direction of the firm.
Yeah.
Tell us what you guys did.
So, we had many intentions to go digital prior to COVID. We even made an investment in developing an app at one point, but it just split our focus way too much that like we weren't focused on marketing and sales for our 200-hour. We were more focused on the app, and we weren't doing either thing great. And so we were like, okay, pause on digital. Let's again, be sustainable, which many of you future entrepreneurs will learn that lesson hopefully sooner than I did. But when COVID hit, we were in the middle of our 200-hour training. We had done 8 days out of 18, and we had 5 trainings across the country happening for 350-ish educators. So we had to ask ourselves very quickly, one, are we going to do this online? 2, is it possible for us to build that same sense of community, connection, and relationships that we do in person online? And then the other question that we asked is like, can we actually effectively certify and develop experts in wellness and yoga and social emotional learning in the online space? We had only done it for real in person. And so we ended up saying, you know what, we absolutely are going to turn it online. I didn't realize, and our team didn't realize, how much we had benefited from using Zoom for 5 years, because we're a remote team. And so we had almost unconsciously developed a lot of the skill sets that we needed to do the work to change it to an online learning platform. And our NPS was like almost higher than ever. And the level of quality, like, either sustained or grew. It was amazing. And so after COVID, or after we finished that training, then we decided, okay, wait, hold on. Let's actually take a step back. Actually, it was before we finished it. It was really when shelter in place happened, and we had to ask ourselves and confront what everyone in the world is confronting, like, what is next? Because we had for 5 years only been an in-person service company. And so we, my natural tendency as a leader is to like want to go fast, to grow, to like make decisions, which my team is a great balance for me. But my team said, you know what? No, Ilana, it's not time to like be fast in this decision making. We need to make the right decision, and we need to see what our community really needs right now. And so we basically dropped everything for about 2 weeks, and our team interviewed, like, we did our research. We interviewed hundreds of educators, people who had taken our training,
Wow.
people who had expressed interest in our training, parents, administrators, superintendents. I mean, all the people that we
Not
could
many not many ventures would do that, even if it's only for 2 weeks. But taking that time out, I'm sure you gained a hell of a lot of insight on that stuff.
I mean, I was just like, let's just do our 200-hour online. Let's go. And what we ended up thank God we didn't do that. I was like, let's go. And my team was like, halt. So we learned so much from our customers and from our community. I mean, what we ended up finding, we basically said, what do you need right now and how can we help? And what we ended up finding was that what educators, and now that parents are educators, they always have been, but now they're at home with the kids all the time. What educators, parents, and community leaders are saying they need is people, given what's happening in our world, just absolutely need to take care of themselves, to build that foundation for their own well-being so they can even do the critically important work of taking care of our kids. That was the first. And the second was, for most people, they're like, I just need the foundations. Like, I need foundational mindfulness, social emotional learning, and mindful movement practices that I can use to support the social emotional needs of my kids and the trauma that everyone in my community is facing right now.
Did that change your revenue model at all when you did that, or you still were able to charge? Okay.
Totally.
Go ahead.
We used to, we charged $29.95 for our in-person trainings, but we ended up providing some scholarships. So it ended up being about an average of $2,600 when they were in person. And then once we found out what we were doing online, which was, we decided based on what people were saying that we're not just going to translate our yoga teacher training into digital. We're actually going to create a new training, which is a more foundational training, our mind, body, wellness, and social emotional learning training, which gives people that foundational well-being practice for themselves and the foundations to teach these practices to the young people that they serve. And it's like your starter pack. And then we also decided that that's the foundation, so it can be way more accessible to way more people. And our market, it completely expanded, because we used to only serve like 10 or 11 cities, and you had to be in that location. You had to,
Very people dependent. Yeah.
childcare was a huge issue for a lot of people. Money was a huge issue. And so we decided that, you know, when we would need a product that way more people could afford and that way more people from across the globe could do, given the needs of our community and our world. So we did that training. We launched it. The timeline is insane. We decided to do it in late April. We launched it public facing, like from a marketing standpoint, May 11th. We hadn't built anything at that point. Then we had our first training, which is a mixture of live sessions on Zoom and self-paced on-demand content, starting a month later on June 15th. So we had 1 month to build out an entire course, which I'd never done before. So I learned it takes a lot longer than.
So you're doing the classic, the classic thing they call out there a pivot, right?
100%.
Yeah, which is amazing. Now, when you got to this new point, and now do you see this as kind of the future direction, or are you're still going to do the in-person along with the new online delivery and stuff?
Well, so to put things in perspective, so we launched on May 11th, and then we had over 250 people sign up in a few weeks for our online mind, body, wellness and SEL course. And then we have our yoga teacher training starting in September. And we were like, okay, let's have an option to bundle them together. And the yoga teacher training is $14.95. So it's 3 times as expensive as the introductory course. And so we decided that, you know, there could be a $250 discount if you buy 2 together. And we thought maybe 5 to 10% would get the bundle, but over 50% got the bundle. Wow. And then when we were in the training in the first track, we upsold. So now we're working with maybe like 100 left who haven't had the bundle, and over 25 people then signed up for the advanced training that's in the fall. And so now we're looking at, wow, like this is amazing. So this is a smaller doorway in, but it's to such a bigger audience, and people love it. We got a 90 NPS score.
Holy cow. And if people don't know, NPS is Net Promoter Score, right? Is that what you're talking about? Yep. Would you refer this to somebody else? Now, looking back on the first 5 years, what are some measurements, ratios? What are key, not necessarily numbers, but what are things you watch to kind of monitor how well or your team monitors to monitor the success of the organization, or things might need to be tweaked a little bit?
Such a great question, because there's a lot of things I think I would do differently. But
that would be my next question, but go ahead.
Yes. And I think I didn't finish answering your last one, which is, I think in the future, when we can go back in person, we will definitely still have it online. I mean, we will go in person. It might be more strategic because of what I'm about to share, but I think we've found something that is so scalable and so accessible to people that's working. And there's nothing like in person. So we'll never want to get rid of that completely. I think we'll end up doing both in the long run. But the things that we were tracking in the first couple of years, we were so focused on revenue, and we were doing great from a revenue standpoint, but we weren't focused on the expenses. So what ended up as focused as we should have been, as diligent as we should have been, which is why we needed to raise more, like go through a round of like seed funding. So, you know, we were seeing, like, as we were expanding to like 11 cities and seeing millions of dollars come in each year, we're like, oh my God, we're crushing it. But we weren't like,
that's really expensive.
We weren't ensuring that all members of our team who were owning different areas were like really looking at the details of the expenses, especially, and one of our biggest expenses was trainers. And we would be what we did was we were like, for a while, in order to expand, we had to like fly trainers across the country, get them Airbnbs. And so all of that adds up
Really
a
expensive.
lot.
Yeah.
And, I am so focused on quality, and I think I've learned to like, balance the need for quality with like the need to like ensure the financial well-being of your company. And so over the last year and a half, we've gotten so much more strategic about like not just revenue, because that doesn't matter if your expenses are more than your revenue, because you're never going to be a profitable,
Absolutely.
sustainable company. And so how can we build our model so that, like, as we're quote growing, we were growing in impact, we were growing in like huge, we're all over the place, but we weren't growing smart. So
Yeah.
how can we ensure that as we're growing, we're looking at every like line item in the budget and trying to maximize for the right type of growth, which will allow us to be like all of our lifelong,
that's a revelation almost all firms go through, that especially if they've been growing a lot. You just have to experience it. You can talk about it and everything, but until you face it, then you do it. Then you have to revise and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So looking back, two last questions. First one, looking back, and you've kind of touched on a few principles or things. Would there be anything you would have done differently over the last 5 years, in addition to some of the things you've talked about? Would you have slowed down on the growth more, or would you have, would you have done this sooner, or what would be, or would you have changed hiring practices? Just anything that you can really think of that you might have done differently.
It's funny because I love this question, and there's so many things that if I were to do it again, I would do differently. But I would never have wanted to change what I did, because I learned so much from the mistakes that I made. And I think like now, thank God we made it out on the other side to where like, okay, we're alive and we now are a little healthier as a company. I think that there's a few things that I would change. I mean, definitely for me, as someone who doesn't have the business background, like I hadn't started a company before. I'd started a nonprofit way back in the day, but I'm entrepreneurial in spirit. But I think I would have talked to way more advisors to get input on how do I set up from the beginning a financially viable company while still making the impact that I'm so committed to making in the world.
That's a real good lesson learned.
And I also think, I think my perspective on like raising money has changed a little bit too. Like I used to think that if we're raising money, that means we're doing awesome, like growth. But I think we wouldn't have necessarily needed to raise money if we were smart from the beginning. So
the two-edged sword.
Totally. And
maybe
like, I love our advisors and our investors. So that's another thing. Make sure you have the right people on your board, because
and you did that from the beginning, not to toot my own horn. I'm on the
you were on it.
But you put together a really good board of advisors way back. So last question I'll ask you, and then we'll call it an interview. But what would you tell? What would be some suggestions you'd give to an undergrad, a grad student at UW, not just a business student, but just any undergrad grad at UW? What would be any advice that you could think of that you'd want to leave with them? Kind of like you're almost like you're doing a speech at graduation. What would be the one thing you want to take away from it?
I think about what you care about most in your life and pursue, like, recognize that your story can transform into your dream organization. So if you have this, like, think about what you stand for, what you're passionate about. In my case, it was like, oh my God, these teachers are so stressed, like something has to happen. And if you just speak your story into the space, into the community, then people will follow. Like if you are aligned with your passion, if you are aligned with that sense of purpose and that conviction about like what needs to change, and it comes from your story, then you can create anything that you want and you'll find the right people to be a part of that movement. So I would say, don't feel like you don't have, like you need to come up with the whole business plan and all the things and have every, years and years of experience and education to start your own thing. I had zero. And now my organization is all over the nation and world. And it's because it becomes
In
a
5 years.
shared vision.
Yeah. And really kind of to summarize, really find a need. You saw a need and a problem, and just, sought out solutions to the problem, and have kind of adjusted along the way. Well, Ilana, I just wanted to say thank you so much. I
You're
appreciate you
welcome.
taking the time. And for people that are the background to Ilana, that's an example of her training at a gymnasium
Oh
all the
yeah.
way around. So just to make sure people understand what that is, but appreciate you taking the time for this. I think great interview, and always good to stay in touch with you, and
You
look
too.
forward to keeping you in the loop and keeping abreast of what's going on long term.
Yeah, me too. And I am so excited for everything that all of you who are watching this end up bringing into the world, because let's be honest, our world needs you. So